Hello boys and girls, Adam Nicholas here for What Culture Wrestling, and yes, it is that time of the week, once again, the week, the month, the year where Stone Cold Steve Austin puts out another Broken Skull Sessions podcast, and we break it down into 10 easy, manageable, bite-sized bits of information just for you. Because to be honest, who's got an hour to spend watching Stone Cold Steve Austin interview people? I know I certainly don't, unless you're gonna pay me. Anyway, he's had some fantastic guests up until this point, hasn't he? He's had The Undertaker, he's had Bret the Hitman Hart, he's had Goldberg, and I'll be totally honest, Jerry the King Lawler would not have been at the top of my personal list of someone to interview, but it was actually quite a fascinating little watch, and we managed to get some interesting anecdotes and a few brilliant ones, specifically from his career prior to WWE. So if that's your sort of thing, lots there, but still a lot for the modern day audience too. And we get this amazing dynamic because Stone Cold is actually such a Jerry the King Lawler stan. An interesting thing revealed there. I think you could call him Stan Cold Steve Austin. Look, sometimes you have to find the gold and sometimes the gold finds you. I don't make the rules. That's just how it happens. Anyway, enough of my yammering. Let's break this podcast down. My name is Adam Nicholas. This is What Culture Wrestling, and these are the 10 things we learned from Jerry Lawler on Stone Cold's Broken Skull Sessions podcast. Number 10. The King moniker was an accident. Now, it would be hard to imagine Jerry the King Lawler without his King gimmick, I think we can all agree, but when he was asked about where it all came from and what the origins of it was, actually, the story behind it is kind of tragic, to be honest. It started when he was wrestling down in Memphis, and he said he was cutting a promo on the local hero Jackie Fargo, and basically said, "You've been the king for a long time, but you're looking at the kid who's going to knock you off your throne." The King would go over that night, and after the show, as he was walking outside, some of the fans started calling him King. Now, Lawler didn't think too much about this, to be honest, he said, until he spotted a worker backstage called Bobby Shane, and he was carrying a crown and a robe, and he had a bit of a eureka moment. So he said to Shane, he said, "Whereabouts could I get myself one of these crowns and one of these robes from?" Because he thought it'd be funny to cut a one-off promo on Fargo, basically just mocking him again in the get-up. Would have been quite a funny thing. But Shane said, "You don't need to do that, you don't need to buy one, you can just borrow mine, because I'm going on tour to Australia for a month." Sadly though, Shane would never actually get that robe and cape back, because during his flight back from Australia, he crashed before he landed and was fatally killed in the accident. As a tribute to Shane, Lawler decided to keep wearing the gear, and basically the rest, as they say, is history. So out of that really tragic thing came this gimmick that would come to define Jerry the King Lawler. Number 9, his side of the crown crapping story. Now, this is a bit of an infamous story within wrestling, but anybody who knows their history will know that Jerry the King Lawler once suffered the unfortunate circumstance, I guess we'll call it, of a bunch of wrestlers taking a dump in his crown. Yes, that's something that actually happened. He told Austin he remembered walking backstage on the fateful night of said dumping, and he had Jimmy Hart came running towards him and basically said he was worried, don't go in the locker room, because a bunch of the guys had taken a in his crown. And I don't think there's any better way to say that. That's just what happened. Now, as you can imagine, Jerry the King Lawler was not very happy about this. This had kind of come because the guys backstage, I guess they were sour on Lawler a bit, because they thought there'd been some rubbish payoffs that had happened down in Memphis, and they were going to take it out on him. This was their idea of a revenge act. So Lawler went to Vince McMahon and basically told him, "I don't think I'm going to work here anymore. This isn't going to work, and I don't want to suffer through that for the rest of my time here." But Vince McMahon soothed his worries and told Lawler it would never happen again, and nothing of that nature would continue in his company. And true to his word, he actually stuck to it. Everything seemed to settle down for Lawler a bit, but still, a sh in your hat is just not. It's not great, really, is it? Number 8, the Andy Kaufman insight is amazing. Now, to be honest, the majority of this interview dives into Lawler's time before WWE. It's about a good 40-minute stretch before we talk about anything from 1993 onwards. If you're not into your wrestling history, that might not be your taste, but there is a fantastic moment when he starts to talk about the relationship he had with Andy Kaufman and the work that they did together. According to Lawler, Kaufman ad-libbed most of his rivalry during that time with Jerry the King Lawler, as you remember that famous rivalry where wrestling and acting met in the middle. But ultimately, he said he tried to keep everybody in the dark with regards to what was happening, including Lawler, in terms of he wanted to really blur that line between kayfabe and reality. But as you can imagine, it got very interesting indeed when they talked about the time they were both on David Letterman's show together. There was this whole air from the producers that they wanted the two to kiss and make up on air, but they had different ideas. They wanted to work everybody there, so what they did, of course, was the infamous slap. Jerry the King Lawler slapping Kaufman live on television, and to this day, he says, that Letterman said to him this was the only time he ever felt his show completely got away from him. Number 7, on-set problems with Jim Carrey. Now imagine having all that weird and fascinatingly unpredictable time with Andy Kaufman, and then a few years later, Jim Carrey would be playing Kaufman in a film, and you'd have to do it all over again, only this time it was somebody pretending to be Kaufman, and things got very, very weird indeed. Lawler said that he wasn't a fan of Kerry's method acting at all, and he said the whole experience was something he just didn't really enjoy. Apparently it was so weird at one point, Kerry had actually thrown a bottle of juice at him, a glass bottle that smashed on the floor near him, and to which point King obviously was quite confused, and he just yelled at him, "I'll get you," like Abe Simpson yelling at a cloud or something. The producers told Lawler he just had to roll with the punches because Jim Carrey was the star and he was the main reason why the Man on the Moon film was being made and getting the green light in the first place, so they had to just kind of do whatever he wanted. But Lawler would end up getting, I guess, a modicum of revenge, if you want to call it that, because he talks about a moment where Carrey absolutely lost his mind when they were doing a scene together and he forgot one of his lines or sort of stumbled over it, at which point the King, rather smugly, fed him the line and Carrey went absolutely ballistic. Apparently threw a massive tantrum for ages before finally sitting down and calmly saying to King, "You're right, I forgot my line," and actually just had to admit that he was wrong. So Jim Carrey got absolutely schooled in the acting world at one point by Jerry the King Lawler. That's worth the price of admission alone. Number 6, what he'd change about his WrestleMania debut. Now incredibly, Jerry the King Lawler didn't have a match at WrestleMania his entire career until 2011, where he obviously had that long, boring, painful match with Michael Cole with Stone Cold Steve Austin as the special guest referee. I mean, this is a match that a lot of fans consider to be actually like the worst match in WrestleMania history, and fair enough, I guess. And Lawler seems pretty cool about it too, but he says he's not really happy with how the whole thing went down and it won't be fondly remembered. He says he's not crazy about the way that it went, but ultimately he felt if it was just been a little bit shorter, maybe it could have been better. Between the pair of them, they can't really understand why it took this long for Lawler to get a match at WrestleMania. Stone Cold says it should have happened decades sooner, and you can tell when King talks about it, he's a little bit uneasy because he doesn't want to bury Michael Cole. But that one match that he had was against a commentator, and I don't think he's very keen on that at all, to be honest. Number 5, Lawler's commentary philosophy. Now, if you're some of the younger fans who are watching this interview, the second half is probably more catered towards you. This is the point where King starts to break down his career as a commentator for WWE, and obviously talks about that world-famous partnership that he had with Jim Ross during the Attitude Era, and his whole approach to being a commentator. And for my money, I don't think I can remember him actually breaking that down and talking about it as much as he does here, and it's fascinating. The King says he always tried to look like it was just two buddies sitting on a couch watching wrestling together, which I think he pretty much nailed, to be honest. And on top of that, he says he felt like he was never really a great announcer. The job he had was the easier side of things, and he was just working with some brilliant people, which is quite a humble approach, really, for a man whose entire moniker is being the King. And not just that, but he does also give his take on the current commentators and their role in WWE at the moment. He feels the company doesn't want to let the commentators outshine the talent in the ring, and he's kind of not sure if that's the way to go because unfortunately it makes them all sound a bit like brain dead robots. Number 4, where the high-pitched voice came from. If you were a fan during the Attitude Era, you will undoubtedly have grown up with the sound of Jerry the King Lawler's voice getting higher and higher and squeakier as he got excited, regardless of what the stimuli are. We won't get into those, but ultimately that was the trademark of Jerry the King Lawler, and I'll be honest, even myself playing with wrestling figures back in the day, that was the voice I'd choose to do because there was nobody who sounded more excited than Jerry the King Lawler. When Lawler broke it down though, it was quite simple really. When JR got excited and the action was building up, his voice would go raspy and deep. So Lawler said he just went in the opposite direction to give the fans something different to listen to, and ultimately it would provide such a high-pitched voice that would cut through all of the action in the ring and make everything he said incredibly memorable, and I'll be honest, it worked. The King knew that his voice was going to be heard during some of the most important moments in wrestling history and WWE television history, so why not make it memorable? And I think, all in all, the fact that we're still talking about him and people are watching this video, I guess he did his job. Number 3, who really came up with puppies? It is probably fair to say that almost everything that came out of Jerry the King Lawler's mouth during the Attitude Era is now, in hindsight, very inappropriate, extremely questionable, and would not last 5 minutes in the landscape that is 2020. But they did happen, we can't change that. What I can do though is give you some information regarding some of the things that he said and the origins of those things, like puppies, for example. One of Lawler's more infamous gimmicks though was his dirty old man routine. You know the one, he just loved boobies, he loved women, he loved everything to do with sex and women and things that are inappropriate because because the Attitude Era. Now, fair play to Stone Cold for actually even asking the question, given the fact that we are on the WWE Network watching this, but Lawler said, despite the fact that Austin was probably sure he'd come up with it by himself, that apparently he didn't. Apparently it was Road Dogg who had said it backstage. Lawler had heard him, he nicked it and made it his own, and as we all know now, puppies is something you associate with Jerry the King Lawler during the Attitude Era. Number 2, those toupee jokes were Vince's idea. Now, despite having the best chemistry with JR, Lawler said that the person he most enjoyed working on commentary with was Vincent Kennedy McMahon. Of course, they spent time in the comedy booth together, and he said the one thing that he loved the most about Vince was the fact that he was so self-deprecating. The man was not afraid to take the piss out of himself. Now, as you remember, when those two were on commentary together, they used to do a gimmick, or certainly King did, where he'd take the mick out of Vince McMahon's hair. He'd always say that it looked like a toupee because it was kind of fake looking. Well, apparently, that wasn't the King's idea. That was Vince's idea. He would tell Lawler, poke fun at my hair, they'll like that, before he would often hold onto it just in case the King was going to try and move it, just to add to the joke a little bit more. More commitment to the bit than that magician with the fishbowl in The Prestige. The King also said that Vince personally told him how fond he was of his commentary work, which was why he never used to get much of an ear chewing in his headset, as we know that all the commentators do. Poor JR used to get shouted down on a weekly basis, but Lawler, apparently he got away scot-free. And number 1, I don't want to do that. You'd imagine that if you were a wrestler or a wrestling personality or anybody who's been involved with WWE for quite a long time, getting into the WWE Hall of Fame is surely a dream come true, right? Well, apparently not when it came to Jerry the King Lawler, because when he found out via the phone of Vince McMahon that Vince was considering putting him in the Hall of Fame for 2007, he didn't want to do it because he feared that if he went into the Hall of Fame, that meant he might be getting the boot from the company. And as you can imagine, it was quite weird for Vince McMahon, because nobody had reacted like this when he broke the news to them about going to the Hall of Fame, and he was quite concerned. But when King explained himself and Vince was able to give him some assurances about his concerns and tell him that he wouldn't be taking him off TV after WrestleMania 23, all of a sudden, big U-turn, and the King is in. Strange that really, isn't it? It's almost like Jerry the King Lawler has been at WWE for so long, and he's seen so many of his friends put out to pasture before their time, and was a little bit concerned. Can't imagine what would have given him that impression. That's none of my business. So there you have it. Those are all the things we learned from Jerry the King Lawler on Stone Cold Steve Austin's Broken Skull Session podcast. Let us know your thoughts about that episode, about this video, in the comments down below. Don't forget to like and share. Hit the old subscribe button if you haven't already. You can find the original article for this at whatculture.com/WWE, or you can follow What Culture on Twitter at WhatCulture WWE. You can also follow me on Twitter, if that's your thing, at It's Adam Nicholas, or perhaps you would just like some more videos. If you would, you should be able to find some just over here, I believe. Anyway, this has been What Culture Wrestling. I've been Adam Nicholas, and I will see you next time.